up the Basics of the Faith forum that James and I did. I don't even remember when we did it last, a while ago. The format, as some of you may recall, is a little bit like you get 15 minutes of theology TED Talk from James and I, hopefully 15 minutes. I've noticed that we've never actually met that time because, we talk. And then hopefully there'll be some time for some question and answer and some back and forth. And the thought behind this is really to just give a kind of nugget of theological reflection on issues that are essential to our faith. So in the last Basics of the Faith, we talked about, easy things like the image of God and sin and salvation. And we, 15 minutes totally covered it all. There was nothing really significant to talk about afterwards. It was totally great. So what we want to do is sort of pick that up. But we only have 3 weeks this time, and we're going to talk about discipleship. Discipleship it comes out of, we sort of talked about the big theology concepts last time, but what does it actually look like to mean and live our faith as disciples? What does that word even mean? Where does it come from? What does that look like for us today as a community? I'm going to talk today. James is going to take on next week, and then the third week, James will have to do, because I just discovered I won't actually be here on that Sunday. So you're going to get one of me and two of James. And some of this is loosely based on a book by Rowan Williams that I came across. Actually, there's another church in the area that's reading it, and I noticed that, and I thought, I'm kind of curious about this book. It's called Being Disciples. If you remember from last time, I love Rowan Williams. When I was Eastern Orthodox, I would read Rowan Williams, and I would think, this man makes me want to be Orthodox. Which is ironic because he is Episcopalian. He is Anglican. But Rowan Williams comes and actually has spent a lot of time reading Eastern Christian writing. Both his master's and his PhD work were in Eastern Christian authors. And he talks about discipleship, and we'll show you the book. I actually have it in my purse, which is stuck in the sacristy because I forgot about it. We'll show you the book. It's a very easy read. It's just a collection of talks that he's done. And this conversation will be kind of a reflection, kind of back and forth on what sort of pieces that Williams picks up on, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to actually read if you would like, and probably have some small groups around that if you'd like to. So, discipleship. The word discipleship in Greek comes from the word teacher. It means to teach. So we have didactic in English. The Didache is an ancient text on one of the earliest texts we have on the teaching of the 12 apostles. That's what the Didache, the subtitle of the Didache is, or the kind of the title in English. And so discipleship is all about teaching. But Jesus' first invitation to discipleship in the Gospel of John is he says, come and see. He's walking along and he says to a group of people, come and see. And they do. They come and see. They drop things, and we hear that all the time in the gospel. They drop their job, their fishing nets, they leave their families, and they come and see. And to us, that seems a little bit odd and kind of radical. And the reality is that in the ancient world, it's actually not terribly radical. That ancient understandings of learning from a teacher or from a philosopher are all about spending time with that person, that teacher, that philosopher. So if you guys see images or pictures of, Socrates is teaching a group of people, he's always sitting down with a group of people around him, and some of them are slouching and they're kind of listening, and sometimes there's a wine glass in the corner, and someone's got a scroll and someone's snoozing, because that always happens. But what's happening there is, in the ancient world, when you wanted to learn something from somebody, it wasn't about going to class and taking notes. It was about spending your life with their life. Because the presumption is that teaching is not simply discussion and kind of this sort of didactic learning that we have, where someone gives you a lecture and you take notes, exactly like this format is happening right now, but rather it's about attaching yourself to a community that is all about watching somebody, listening to somebody, observing somebody, and doing what it is they do. You eat with them, you sleep with them, you walk with them, you hang out with the people that they're hanging out with. And I think actually this is a way that we learn as human beings. We don't primarily learn in the lecture hall. While I am a nerd, I like a good lecture, I love a good book, that's not actually how things sort of sink deeply into us. It's the practice of living that. And in the ancient world, if you followed a philosopher or a teacher or a rabbi, you literally followed that person. You walked with them. You lived where they lived. You picked up and you moved, and you went to study in the great centers of learning in the big cities, which actually meant you lived in a community with a group of people, and you spent all your time with them, because the understanding is that a person may say something, but what they do enforces what it is that they say. It models what it is that they say. And the understanding is that by you doing that as well, you become a person who changes their habits, right? We all know what habits are. Habits are those things that we kind of do instinctively, naturally. Habits are those things we don't have to think about it very much. It's habitual action. Well, the understanding in the ancient world is that learning is by habit. And the way you learn a new habit is you do a new habit. Okay? And all of us, I think there have probably been times in our lives where we have spent time thinking about or trying to learn a new habit or unlearn an old habit. And then when you unlearn an old habit is you learn something new. You know, for me, when I used to come into my dorm room, and, you know, I'd throw my stuff around and whatever, and then I would have to go to class in the morning, and every time there was this flurry of, where are my keys? And it was just, and my roommate would be like, oh my God, seriously, Maria, you lost your keys again. She always knew where her keys were. She's one of my good friends. She still knows where her keys are. It makes me crazy. One day I walked into our dorm room, and she says, stop. And I'm like, and she goes, take your keys out. See that bowl? Put them there. And I'm like, that's weird. Why would I do that? And for like a week, I would come into the dorm room, and she would just be like, stop. Put your keys in the bowl. And the thing is, we never had that morning panic anymore. There was no moment when I was like, where are my keys? She's like, they're in the bowl. I'm like, oh. And actually, it kind of stuck with me. You know, my wife would disagree with this. I still have my moments. I have like 4 places where my keys end up now, as opposed to, you know, none at all. But that's better than none at all. But that's the formation of a habit, right? Somebody says, here, do this. And somebody says, do it consistently and regularly. And so discipleship in the ancient world is understood as kind of forming habits that enabled us to be the kind of people that we are. So when Jesus says, come and see, he's inviting people to come and see and watch and observe and do. By seeing and being with people, we actually become a different kind of person. We become a person who embodies whatever philosophy it is that's happening. And so when Jesus does that, he's appealing to a practice that is ancient and that seems kind of radical to us, but is also completely natural to how we learn. If you read current learning theory and teaching theory, it's all about like doing. It's practicing. And Ron Williams talks about the way in which part of discipleship is about watching. It's about expectant watching. He has this great analogy about bird watchers. Bird watchers sit and they patiently watch and they wait for 5 seconds of a brilliant bird flashing by. He talks about, T.S. Eliot talks about a kingfisher flashing by, light on light in the wings. And that moment of many, many minutes and many even hours of sitting and waiting, there's a moment there when you suddenly see the presence of what it is that you're waiting and looking for. And so discipleship is about cultivating that watching and that waiting, but with an expectancy. The expectancy is that you will indeed see something of God. And underlying that is a kind of a notion that God is already acting and working in the world. God is already doing something. And what we're called to do is put ourselves in a place and a situation where we will see and learn what it is that God is doing in the world, that we'll be able to recognize it. We'll be able to have those moments of, oh, this was God. Now sometimes those moments, and I think our experience, happen in retrospect. We look back and we think, oh, that was God. That was God's presence. But by together watching, by being expectant, by assuming that God is in the world, and then looking for God in the world, we are putting ourselves in a place to see what it is that the God that we follow is doing, how God is acting, so that we then can also do and act. One thing that I think is very clear in the Gospels is that coming and seeing and following Jesus means being around the kind of people that Jesus is around. Jesus tends to spend his time around people that we wouldn't normally want to spend our times around. Now, we don't really, tax collectors are kind of no big deal to us. As a matter of fact, we really love our CPAs because taxes are so confusing that we really need to go to someone who can help us understand how it is that we're supposed to collect our taxes so that we can send them off to the IRS. That's not an image that we get as powerfully today. But the understanding of being around people who skimmed off the top. I mean, how many of you guys actually want to go hang around someone you know is skimming off the top of their business? How many people, you really want to associate with them? That reputation becomes yours. You end up in a court of law and they're going to start asking you questions. How many of us really actually want to go and hang out underneath the Burnside Bridge on Thursday nights with people who haven't showered, who haven't had a haircut, who don't have decent clothing, and who are dragging around their entire life? Now, I saw a hand go up. Okay? There is something about being a part of a Christian community where actually that becomes normal. Because that's normal for Jesus. The normal for Jesus is to hang around people that make us uncomfortable. You can decide who it is that makes you uncomfortable. You can decide, for those of us at St. Michael's, it actually might be all the conservatives in the world that make us really uncomfortable. We don't really want to hang out with our gun-toting relatives. We don't really want to hang out with Trump voters. Let's just be honest, we're not all that excited about an upcoming Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas dinner where we're actually going to have to listen to our racist cousin make casual comments that we're like, oh, that's not appropriate. Those are the people that we don't want to hang out with, and yet Jesus was with everybody. Jesus hung out with those people, and the reputation of those people becomes the reputation of us. And that's not just, I think, because there is that being with those who are different, with those who are other. It's not just because that's kind of important or a value of the gospel, but I think it's a value of the gospel because the reality is we are transformed by relationship. Discipleship is always about the relationships that we form. It's always about the company we keep, who we hang out with. And the question is there something that I could learn about God in this person who is different than I am, who thinks differently than I do, who has experienced the world in a way that I have not experienced? Can I learn something from them that transforms me? Okay? Discipleship is always about the company we keep. And the dark side of this, the flip side of this, is Christian communities have tended very strongly to say, well, the company I keep needs to be only those who are holy and righteous and pure. And we see that in our religious, we see that kind of in the religious conversation today among both liberals and conservatives. This is not just the territory of one particular group, but that kind of idea that we cannot be around those who are different than us, that those who bring us low, those who have ideas or ways of thinking that challenge us. We want a separate community. We want a nice, holy community. We want a church that is a place of peace and where we enjoy one another, where we want to have meals together. We don't actually want to have an argument over dinner. We don't actually want to have over coffee, have to have a conversation that makes us uncomfortable. We like nice, pleasant chit-chat. And so there's something in this kind of understanding of who we spend time with that can actually have a dark side where it becomes a way of, yet again, of excluding. The gospel today is about who's in and who's out. That's how it's been kind of classically interpreted. And what we want to do, that we want to separate ourselves from those around us. And yet, Jesus is constantly calling us to be in uncomfortable and difficult places and situations. to form relationship, because it is relationship that changes us and transforms us as disciples. That's the foundation of almost any conversation about what it means to follow Christ, what it means to live in Christ, what it means to participate in God, is to actually be in relationship. Because God today in the Spirit is present in us. We don't actually have Jesus walking around with us. Believe me, if we did, I have a lot of questions for Jesus. I'm like, did you really say that in the gospel today? Because I don't really think that was a great story to tell. It left up a lot of interpretation that I'm not very comfortable with, and I really wish you had said this, because clearly I know better, right? I know what Jesus should actually be talking about. But Jesus isn't actually here with us today.
Well, in the Spirit.
And in the Spirit, Jesus is present. And that's, the Holy Spirit is what is with us, and this Holy Spirit is working through us and enabling us to be, through our lives together, through the lives that we share with a community that helps teach us and support us, and also in our lives outside of this community, where we may actually be deeply challenged, where we may be deeply transformed. That is the relationship in which the Spirit is working through us and in us, so that we are both a community of disciples who learn together and a community of disciples who go out and act and respond and participate in God. And so coming and seeing, coming and following is not simply coming and receiving, listening to the gospel and listening to the sermon and receiving the sacraments, though all of those things I think are incredibly important. And a good liturgy is actually a liturgy that forms us into the people we're called to become. A good liturgy is a liturgy that says when you exchange peace with your neighbor, what you're doing is learning a habit of exchanging peace with everybody that you meet on the street. That's a habit-forming practice that we do. When we come together to eat and drink, we are creating a habit of eating and drinking with people that maybe we like and maybe we don't like. But we're understanding that we eat and drink together all the time. That's what we're called to do as disciples, in the hopes that we will go out and eat and drink together with those around us. So discipleship is about coming and seeing. It's about following. It's about learning. It's about watching. And then it's about doing. It's about acting out what we see and what we experience in a way that then transforms us. One of the things that I love about the Creed, some of you know that I actually love the Nicene Creed, is the word for when Jesus, it's in our translation it says, and Jesus became truly human. A slightly older English translation says, and Jesus was made man. The word made is a deeply problematic word, because the Greek word, and I don't usually get nerdy about Greek, but this is one of like two words that I kind of get nerdy about Greek on. In Greek, the word really means becoming human. It's actually a gerund. It's a verb that has an ongoing action to it. Because the understanding is that in the incarnation, Jesus is becoming human because we are all becoming human. Humanity is not a static state that we get from God. The ancient teachers sort of do a pun on the image and likeness of God. The image is this thing that we are given by God, but the likeness is this thing that we're becoming. Now, this is bad Hebrew exegesis, and that's fine, but Scripture is meant to be played with to a certain degree, and there's this understanding that we are becoming like God. You've heard me talk, if you've been to previous Back to Basics forums, you heard me talk about theosis, this idea from Peter, 1 Peter, where we are becoming like God in our lives, that Jesus became human so that we humans can become like God. And it is an ongoing process that will happen over the course of our whole lives. And the way that it happens is by watching, by waiting with one another, by sitting with one another, by learning with one another, by expectantly observing what is around us and then practicing that goes forward, that we're learning together. And so when Jesus becomes human, we too are becoming human through the course of our whole lives. And one of the great hopes for me, as someone who just thinks heaven with babies and clouds sounds really boring, it sounds dreadful to me. I had a professor once who I was complaining about this, and she said, "What are you talking about? In eternity, there's no end of our growth. There's no end of our transformation. The horizon that is God, we never get there. Because we're never actually going to be God as God. And as we learn more about God, God expands and grows, and we continue to expand and grow. And I find that really exciting because I don't like sitting still very much. And so discipleship is entering into that relationship with God and relationship with one another that then allows us to constantly transform and become more fully human as we love one another and care for one another, and celebrate together and grieve together, and then go out and serve the world together. Done.